The first gunshot of the evening split the air just as Florence Harding stepped off the stagecoach into the dusty main street of Cimarron, New Mexico, one hand protectively cradling the small swell of her belly beneath her travel-worn dress. It was May 1879, and the setting sun painted the distant Sangre de Cristo Mountains a bloody red that matched the desperation in her heart. "Madam, you might want to find shelter," the stagecoach driver called down, already flicking the reins to move his team away from whatever trouble was brewing down the street. "This ain't no place for a lady in your condition." Florence clutched her small carpet bag tighter, watching as men scattered from the saloon across the way. Her letter to her cousin had gone unanswered, but she had nowhere else to turn after Edward Preston had taken everything: her savings, her virtue, and her reputation, leaving her with nothing but the child growing inside her and a promise to return that had proven as hollow as her future now seemed. At 22, Florence had thought herself too wise to be fooled by a handsome face and grand promises. The daughter of a shopkeeper in Denver, she'd worked alongside her father until his death the previous year. Then Edward had appeared with his fine clothes and talk of business opportunities. He'd courted her properly, or so she'd thought, until the night he'd convinced her that their marriage was just a formality they'd soon attend to. 2 months later, he disappeared with her inheritance, and the sickness in the mornings had confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. "Miss, are you lost?" A deep voice startled her from her thoughts. Florence turned to find herself face to face with a tall man whose features were shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but the silver star pinned to his vest caught the last rays of sunlight. "I'm looking for Sarah Williams," she said, lifting her chin with what remained of her pride. "My cousin." The man's expression shifted subtly. "Sarah passed on last winter. Influenza took half the town." The world seemed to tilt beneath Florence's feet. No cousin, no refuge, no plan. "I see," she managed, though she didn't see at all, couldn't see any way forward from this moment. "You got folks elsewhere who can help you?" he asked, his eyes dropping briefly to her middle before meeting her gaze again. "No," she admitted. "No one." Another gunshot rang out, closer this time, followed by shouting. The tall man turned toward the commotion, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Wait here," he instructed, but before he could move toward the disturbance, 3 men on horseback thundered past, nearly trampling Florence where she stood. The lawman caught her arm, pulling her roughly to safety against the boardwalk. "Thank you," she gasped, heart pounding. "I'm Sheriff Adams," he said, releasing her arm. "Adams Turner. Those men just robbed the bank. I've got to go after them." "Of course," Florence murmured, stepping back, wondering if her day could possibly get worse. As if in answer, the skies opened, releasing a sudden spring downpour that had been threatening all afternoon. Within seconds, her dress was soaked through, her carpetbag offering little protection for the few possessions she'd brought with her. "Damn it all," Sheriff Turner muttered, looking between her and the direction the bandits had fled. He seemed to come to a decision. "The boarding house is 2 doors down," he said, pointing. "Tell Mrs. Peterson that Adams sent you. I'll catch up with you when I get back." With that, he was striding toward the hitching post where a large chestnut horse waited, leaving Florence alone in the rain. She stood for a moment, overwhelmed by the disaster her carefully planned journey had become, then squared her shoulders and headed toward the building he'd indicated. What choice did she have? Mrs. Peterson turned out to be a stout woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, including Florence's condition. But she offered a room with no questions asked, only a request for payment in advance. "I can pay for 3 nights," Florence said, counting out precious coins from her dwindling funds, "and I'll need work if you know of any." The older woman's gaze softened slightly. "We'll talk about that in the morning. For now, get yourself dried off before you catch your death." The small room was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. Florence changed into her only other dress, hanging the wet one by the window in hopes it would dry by morning. As she sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day finally caught up with her, and she allowed herself a few quiet tears. A gentle knock at the door startled her. Wiping her eyes quickly, she opened it to find Sheriff Turner, still damp from the rain but standing with his hat in his hand. "They got away," he said without preamble. "For now, but that's not why I'm here." Florence waited, uncertain what to expect. "Mrs. Peterson says you're looking for work," he continued. "My sister runs the general store, lost her husband at Glorietta Pass during the war. She could use some help, especially with the books." Florence blinked in surprise. "You'd recommend me? You don't even know me." Something flickered across his face, sympathy perhaps, or something more complicated. "I know enough. You're alone, in trouble, and too proud to beg." "My sister's the same way, thought you might understand each other." Florence wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or insulted. "I can keep books," she said finally. "My father had a shop in Denver." Adams nodded. "Good, be at Miller's General Store at 8 tomorrow. I'll tell Abigail to expect you." He settled his hat back on his head. "And Miss Harding," she supplied. "Florence Harding." "Miss Harding," he continued, "Cimarron's a rough town, but it's not without mercy. You'll find your way here if you've a mind to." With that cryptic assurance, he left, his boot steps echoing down the hallway. Florence closed the door, feeling something she hadn't felt in months, a tiny spark of hope. It wasn't much, just the prospect of honest work and a roof over her head for a while longer, but it was something to hold onto in the gathering darkness. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the fluttering movement that had recently begun. "We'll be all right," she whispered to her unborn child, wishing she believed it. Morning came with the sound of wagon wheels on the rutted main street and the distant lowing of cattle. Florence dressed carefully, pinning her hair in a simple style that she hoped conveyed respectability rather than the desperation she felt. The general store was easy enough to find, its whitewashed front standing out among the weathered buildings of Cimarron. Inside, shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from bolts of cloth to farming tools. A counter ran along the back, behind which stood a slender woman with honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical knot. She glanced up as the bell over the door announced Florence's arrival. "You must be Miss Harding," she said, her voice carrying the same directness as her brother's. "Adams said you'd be by. I'm Abigail Miller." "Thank you for considering me, Mrs. Miller," Florence replied, trying to stand so that her condition wasn't immediately apparent. "Sheriff Turner mentioned you might need help with your accounts." Abigail's sharp gaze took in everything Florence was trying to hide. "Let's be plain, Miss Harding. My brother told me about your situation. I don't care about your past or your troubles, only whether you can count and keep your word. Can you do both?" The bluntness was almost a relief after months of whispers behind her back in Denver. "Yes, madam, I can." "Good. The ledgers are a mess. My eyesight isn't what it was, and numbers were always Samuel's talent, not mine." She gestured to a small desk in the corner. "You can start there. Pays $2 a week with Sundays off. There's a room behind the store you can use if you don't want to stay at the boarding house." The generosity took Florence by surprise. "That's very kind, but it's not kindness," Abigail interrupted. "It's practicality. Having you here early and late will save me time." And she hesitated, something softening in her expression. "And I know what it is to face the world alone when it expects you to have a man's protection." For the first time since learning of her pregnancy, Florence felt understood rather than judged. "Thank you," she said simply. The work was straightforward enough, though the accounts were indeed in disarray. Florence lost herself in the familiar comfort of numbers and order, barely noticing as the hours passed and customers came and went. Abigail proved to be efficient but fair, expecting hard work but acknowledging it with quiet approval. By late afternoon, Florence had made significant progress on the backlog of entries. Her back ached from sitting so long and she stood to stretch, catching sight of Sheriff Turner entering the store. "Abby," he greeted his sister. "Miss Harding." Florence nodded politely, noticing how his presence seemed to fill the small shop. In the daylight, she could see him clearly, for the first time, the strong lines of his face weathered by sun and wind, the startling blue of his eyes contrasting with his tanned skin, the way his movements carried a coiled readiness that spoke of a man accustomed to danger. "How's she working out?" He asked Abigail, though his eyes remained on Florence. She's got a head for figures, his sister replied, and she doesn't chatter. I appreciate both. Adams's mouth curved slightly. High praise from you. He turned to Florence. I need statements from yesterday's robbery. Would you mind coming by the sheriff's office when you're finished here? Might help to have someone who understands bookkeeping look at the bank's records. Of course, Florence agreed, telling herself the flutter in her stomach was the baby, not a reaction to the intensity of his gaze. Good. I'll expect you around 6. With a nod to his sister, he departed. Abigail watched him go, a thoughtful expression on her face. My brother doesn't usually take such an interest in newcomers, she observed. Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. He's just being helpful because of my situation. Adams has never been one for charity cases, Abigail replied. If he's helping you, it's because he sees something worth helping. Before Florence could respond, the door opened again, admitting a well-dressed woman whose pinched expression suggested perpetual disapproval. Mrs. Blackwood, Abigail greeted her with noticeably less warmth than she'd shown to other customers. Mrs. Miller, the woman replied, her gaze sliding to Florence with undisguised curiosity. I don't believe I've met your new assistant. Miss Harding arrived yesterday from Denver, Abigail said, offering no further information. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as she took in Florence's figure. Indeed, how interesting. She turned back to Abigail. I'll need 2 bolts of the blue calico. The Ladies' Aid Society is making curtains for the new schoolhouse. As Abigail helped her, Florence returned to the ledgers, feeling the weight of the woman's stare. It was a familiar sensation now, the mixture of curiosity and judgment she'd faced in Denver once her condition became known. She'd hoped for anonymity in Cimarron, but clearly, news traveled quickly in small towns. After Mrs. Blackwood left, Abigail sighed. Victoria Blackwood fancies herself the moral authority of Cimarron because her husband owns the bank and half the businesses in town. Pay her no mind. I'm used to being talked about, Florence said quietly. Well, you shouldn't have to be, Abigail replied with unexpected fierceness. Now, let me show you that room I mentioned. You look like you could use some rest before you meet Adams. The room behind the store was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a small stove. A curtained doorway led to what Abigail explained was a washroom with a pump and basin. It's not much, but it's private, she said, and no one will bother you here. It's perfect, Florence assured her, thinking of the boarding house where curious eyes had followed her at breakfast. I don't know how to thank you. You can thank me by keeping those ledgers in order, Abigail said practically. Now rest a bit, I'll mind the store. Left alone, Florence sat on the edge of the bed, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps things weren't entirely hopeless. She had work, shelter, and if not friendship, at least the absence of open hostility from Abigail Miller. And then there was Sheriff Turner, with his direct gaze and unexpected kindness. She told herself not to read too much into his interest, a lawman looking out for a vulnerable newcomer, nothing more. Men like Adams Turner didn't look twice at women in her position, except perhaps with pity or contempt. Still, as she lay back on the bed, allowing herself a brief rest, Florence couldn't help remembering the way his eyes had held hers, steady and without judgment. It had been a long time since a man had looked at her that way. Too tired to examine that thought further, she closed her eyes, one hand resting protectively over the small life growing within her, and allowed herself to drift into a light sleep. The sheriff's office was a square stone building across from the saloon, its solid construction suggesting it doubled as the town jail. Florence pushed open the heavy door to find Adams Turner at his desk, papers spread before him, his expression one of focused concentration. He glanced up at her entrance, his stern features relaxing slightly. Miss Harding, thank you for coming. It's no trouble, she replied, conscious of how her heart had picked up its pace. Your sister was kind enough to give me some time to rest first. Adams gestured to a chair beside his desk. Abby doesn't suffer fools, but she's got a good heart underneath all that practicality. She's been very kind, Florence said, seating herself carefully. Kind isn't the word most folks use for my sister, he said with a hint of amusement. But she respects competence, and she said you've got it in spades. The unexpected compliment warmed Florence. The ledgers needed organizing, that's all. Well, these could use the same, he said, pushing several bank documents toward her. The bank manager's more concerned with keeping Harold Blackwood happy than keeping proper records. I need to know exactly how much was taken. Florence bent over the papers, grateful for the familiar task that allowed her to ignore the sheriff's proximity. She worked methodically, making notes as she went, aware of his gaze occasionally resting on her. $3,422, she said finally, plus some personal items from the safe deposit boxes according to these notes. Adams whistled softly. That's a serious haul. The Keller gang doesn't usually hit this big. You know who did it? Florence asked, looking up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I've been trailing them for months, he confirmed. They've hit towns across the territory. Usually they're more careful, take less so they don't attract too much attention. Perhaps they're getting desperate, Florence suggested, or overconfident. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Smart as well as good with figures. Abby was right about you. Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked down at the papers. Will you go after them? Already sent telegrams to the surrounding towns. I'll ride out tomorrow if we get word of their direction. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. How are you settling in? The sudden change of subject caught her off guard. Well enough, everyone has been civil. Did you meet Victoria Blackwood yet? He asked, his tone deliberately casual. Florence couldn't help a small smile. Yes, she seemed interested in my presence. Victoria considers herself the guardian of Cimarron's morality, Adams said dryly. She'll be keeping a close eye on you. Because of my condition, Florence said quietly, one hand instinctively moving to her middle. Adams's expression grew serious. People talk in small towns. They'll speculate, Judge. Some will be kind, others won't. I'm sorry for that. You needn't apologize for others, Florence replied. I'm used to it now. His eyes held hers. You shouldn't have to be. The simple statement, so similar to what his sister had said earlier, touched something deep within Florence. For months, she'd carried not just the physical burden of her pregnancy, but the weight of shame and abandonment. To have someone, especially a man of Sheriff Turner's standing, suggest that the judgment was undeserved was startlingly powerful. The baby's father, Adams said carefully. Is he? Gone, Florence finished for him. Edward Preston. He came to Denver with stories of business ventures and promises of marriage. He left with my father's savings and no intention of returning. Adams's expression darkened. Did you report him to the authorities? Florence gave a bitter laugh. And tell them what? That I was fool enough to believe a man's promises. That I gave him not just my father's money but she broke off, the words sticking in her throat. Your trust, Adams finished softly. Your heart. Florence looked away, unable to bear the understanding in his eyes. Yes, both. And now I have nothing but this child and whatever future I can build for us. That baby needs a father, Adams said, his voice low but firm. Florence's head snapped up, anger flaring suddenly. I'm well aware of what society thinks my child needs, Sheriff. But I'd rather raise this baby alone than with a man who sees us as objects of pity. To her surprise, Adams didn't look offended by her outburst. Instead, there was something like respect in his gaze. I didn't mean to imply you should accept just any man, Miss Harding. Only that you shouldn't rule out the possibility that there are good men who would consider themselves fortunate to help raise your child. Before Florence could respond to this extraordinary statement, the door to the office burst open and a breathless boy of about 12 rushed in. Sheriff. Fight at the Red Dog, Mr. Blackwood's threatening to shoot Tom Reed. Adams was on his feet instantly. Stay here, he told Florence, checking his revolver before striding toward the door. He paused, looking back at her. We'll finish this conversation another time. Then he was gone, leaving Florence with a racing heart and confused thoughts. Had the sheriff been suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? Surely not. They'd barely met. yet something in his manner, in the steady way he'd looked at her. Shaking her head at her own foolishness, Florence gathered the papers she'd been reviewing and placed them neatly on Adams's desk. Whatever he'd meant by his comments, she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Her priority had to be establishing herself in Cimarron and preparing for the child that would arrive in just a few months. With that resolution firmly in mind, she left the sheriff's office and made her way back to the general store, trying to ignore the curious glances of townspeople who'd clearly already heard about the newest resident of Cimarron and her delicate condition. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm. Florence worked long hours at the store, finding satisfaction in bringing order to Abigail's business affairs and gradually learning the inventory and the customers. She moved into the room behind the shop, grateful for the privacy it afforded and the kindness of her employer, who never mentioned Florence's growing belly but quietly left a basket of baby clothes clearly handmade but never used on her bed one evening. Sheriff Turner was often away, tracking the Keller gang or handling disturbances in the surrounding area. When he was in town, he made a point of stopping by the store, ostensibly to see his sister but inevitably finding reasons to engage Florence in conversation. She found herself looking forward to these visits, drawn to his quiet strength and the respect with which he treated her. June turned to July, bringing scorching heat that made Florence's condition more uncomfortable. The baby was active now, its kicks sometimes visible beneath her dresses. Despite the challenges, she felt more at peace than she had since discovering her pregnancy. She had work, a place to live, and if not friends, at least allies in the Turner siblings. Not everyone in Cimarron was so accepting. Victoria Blackwood had taken to visiting the store frequently, bringing with her other ladies from the town whose expressions ranged from curious to openly disapproving. They never said anything directly to Florence, but their whispered comments reached her ears nonetheless. No ring on her finger. Shameful, flaunting her condition. And she's practically living with the sheriff's sister. Florence held her head high and focused on her work, but the constant scrutiny wore on her. One particularly hot afternoon, as she was closing the store while Abigail visited a sick friend, the door opened to admit Harold Blackwood himself, a portly man whose expensive suit seemed at odds with the frontier town. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwood," Florence greeted him politely. "I'm afraid we were just closing." "I didn't come to shop, Miss Harding," he replied, his tone making it clear that her name left a bad taste in his mouth. "I came to make you an offer." Florence stiffened, instantly wary. "What sort of offer? My wife tells me you're in difficulties." His eyes flickered to her stomach. "I understand you have some skill with numbers." "I've been helping Mrs. Miller with her accounts," Florence confirmed cautiously. "I need someone to manage the books at the bank," he continued. "The position comes with decent pay and accommodations in Santa Fe, where no one knows your history." Florence stared at him, understanding dawning. "You want me to leave Cimarron?" Blackwood had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "This is a small town, Miss Harding. People talk. My wife is concerned about the example you're setting for the young women here." "By working honestly and supporting myself?" Florence asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "By flaunting your indiscretion," he replied, "and by your apparent closeness to Sheriff Turner, so that was it." Victoria Blackwood had noticed Adams's interest in her and decided Florence was a threat of some kind. "Sheriff Turner has been kind to a newcomer in difficult circumstances," she said carefully. "Nothing more." Blackwood's expression suggested he didn't believe her. "Regardless, my offer stands. A fresh start in Santa Fe, away from gossip. You could give your child a chance at respectability." The temptation was briefly there, a larger town where she might blend in, steady work, a chance to escape the whispers. But something in his manner, the smug certainty that she would accept charity to slink away in shame, steeled Florence's resolve. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Blackwood," she said coolly, "but I have employment here and Mrs. Miller has been very generous." "I have no intention of leaving Cimarron," his face hardened. You may find the town less welcoming as your condition becomes more obvious. For your own sake and the sake of your child, you should reconsider. Was that a threat? Florence straightened her spine. Good day, Mr. Blackwood. As I said, we're closing now. After a moment of tense silence, he inclined his head slightly and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. My wife was right about you. Too proud for your own good. Pride won't feed a fatherless child, Miss Harding. The door closed behind him with a finality that left Florence trembling, partly with anger, partly with the fear that he might be right. She was making enemies of the most powerful people in town, and for what? A tenuous position in a small store, the uncertain friendship of a lawman who might see her as nothing more than a duty. She was still standing there, lost in troubled thoughts, when the door opened again. Florence tensed, expecting Blackwood's return, but instead, Adams Turner filled the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. Florence, he asked, the use of her given name startling her. Are you all right? You're white as a sheet. I'm fine, she managed, though her voice betrayed her. Just tired, the heat. He crossed to her in 2 long strides, his expression concerned. You should sit down. Where's Abby? Visiting Mrs. Martinez. She's ill. Florence allowed him to guide her to a chair, too shaken by her confrontation with Blackwood to resist. Really, Sheriff, I'm perfectly capable. Adams, he corrected her gently. After all this time, I think you can use my name. He studied her face. Something happened, tell me. Perhaps it was the quiet authority in his voice, or perhaps it was simply that Florence had carried her burdens alone for too long, but she found herself relating the entire conversation with Harold Blackwood. Adams's expression darkened as she spoke, his jaw tightening visibly. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles showed white. Blackwood's overstepping, he finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. This isn't the first time he's tried to run someone out of town who didn't fit his wife's notion of propriety. He has influence here, Florence pointed out, and his concerns aren't entirely baseless. My presence is causing talk. Adams's gaze sharpened. Are you considering his offer? No, she replied honestly, but I'm not blind to the difficulties my situation creates. For myself, for Abigail, for you, for me. He looked genuinely surprised. Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mr. Blackwood implied that there was talk about your interest in me. I wouldn't want to damage your standing in the community. Something flashed in Adams's blue eyes, anger perhaps, or something more complex. My standing can withstand a few whispers, Florence. And Blackwood would do well to remember that I wear this badge at the request of the territorial governor, not at his convenience. Still, Florence persisted, needing him to understand, your kindness to me has been noticed and misinterpreted. Perhaps it would be better if what? He interrupted, his voice suddenly harsh. If I stopped coming around, pretended I didn't care about your welfare, is that what you want? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had voiced before. Florence found herself unable to look away from the intensity of his gaze. No, she admitted quietly, that's not what I want. Adams took a step closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. What do you want, Florence? The directness of the question stole her breath. What did she want? Security for her child, certainly, respect rather than pity. And increasingly, impossibly, she wanted this man before her, his strength, his integrity, the gentleness that lay beneath his stern exterior. It doesn't matter what I want, she said instead. I have to think of my child now. That's not an answer, he pressed, his voice softening. What do you want for yourself? Florence felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. I want to stop being ashamed, she whispered. I want to walk down the street without feeling judged for loving unwisely. I want to believe that my child can have a future here, despite the circumstances of its birth. Adams reached out, his calloused fingers gently tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. You have nothing to be ashamed of, Florence Harding. Nothing. The conviction in his voice nearly undid her composure. The world doesn't see it that way. Then the world is wrong, he stated simply. And as for your child's future, he broke off, seeming to consider his words carefully. I meant what I said before, that baby needs a father. But I wasn't suggesting charity or pity, I was suggesting possibilities. Florence's heart began to race. What sort of possibilities? Before Adams could answer, the door opened again and Abigail entered, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. Florence seated, her brother standing close, his hand just withdrawing from her face. "Well," she said dryly, "I see you two are getting better acquainted." Adams straightened, his expression closing. Florence wasn't feeling well, the heat. Abigail's gaze moved between them, skeptical but not unkind. "I'm sure. Florence, you should rest, I can finish closing up." "I'm fine, really," Florence began, but Adams interrupted. "You should listen to Abby," he said, his tone once again that of the sheriff rather than the man who had just been looking at her with such intensity. "Rest. We can continue our discussion another time." With that, he nodded to his sister and departed, leaving Florence with the distinct feeling that something significant had just happened between them, even if she couldn't quite define what it was. Abigail watched her brother go, then turned to Florence with raised eyebrows. "You want to tell me what that was about?" Florence sighed, too tired to dissemble. "Harold Blackwood came by with an offer of work in Santa Fe. He thinks my presence here is problematic." "That sanctimonious old goat," Abigail muttered. "Let me guess, Victoria put him up to it." "He mentioned she was concerned about the example I'm setting," Florence confirmed. Abigail snorted. "Victoria's concerned about the way Adams looks at you. She's had her cap set for him since her first husband died. Never mind that Adams wouldn't touch her with a 10-foot pole." This was news to Florence. "Mrs. Blackwood is interested in your brother. Victoria is interested in anyone with power or status," Abigail replied dismissively. "Adams is both territorial lawman, respected in the community. The fact that he's shown more interest in you in 3 weeks than he showed her in 3 years is driving her mad with jealousy." Florence felt her face flame. "There's nothing between Sheriff Turner and myself." Abigail gave her a long, measuring look. "No." "Then why does my practical, duty-bound brother find reasons to stop by my store twice a day since you arrived? Why does he ask about you when you're not here? Why does he look at you like you're water in the desert? He feels sorry for me," Florence protested weakly. "Adams Turner doesn't do pity," Abigail said flatly. "If he's interested in you, and he clearly is, it's because he sees something in you worth being interested in. The question is, how do you feel about him?" Put on the spot, Florence found herself unable to dissemble. "He's been kind to me when others haven't. He doesn't look at me like I'm damaged, and he's a good man. Any woman would be fortunate to have his regard. But you're carrying another man's child," Abigail finished for her. "Yes." Florence's hand went to her belly where the baby was currently kicking energetically. "Any attachment would have to consider that reality." Abigail's expression softened unexpectedly. "You know, when Samuel died at Glorietta Pass, I was carrying his child, a little boy. He lived long enough to draw one breath in this world before joining his father." The quiet pain in the older woman's voice brought tears to Florence's eyes. "I'm so sorry." Abigail shook her head. "It was a long time ago, but I tell you this because I want you to understand my brother knows loss. He knows the value of life, of family. The fact that you're carrying a child wouldn't deter him if his feelings run deep. It might even be part of what draws him to you." Florence considered this, remembering Adams's words that baby needs a father. Had he been offering more than sympathy? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I don't know what to think," she admitted. "Then don't think for now," Abigail advised practically. "Rest, as Adams suggested. Things have a way of becoming clearer with time." As Florence retired to her small room, Abigail's words echoed in her mind. Could Adams Turner truly be interested in her, not despite her pregnancy but partly because of it? The possibility seemed too much to hope for, yet the memory of his intensity, the gentle touch of his fingers on her face, suggested something beyond mere kindness. Sleep eluded her that night, her thoughts too tangled with possibilities and fears. The baby was restless too, its movements a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried. By morning, she was exhausted but no closer to understanding her own heart, let alone Adams Turner's. The days that followed brought no opportunity for the promised continuation of their conversation. Word came that the Keller gang had been spotted near Las Vegas, and Adams rode out with a hastily assembled posse. Florence told herself the hollow feeling in her chest was relief at avoiding a potentially awkward discussion, not disappointment at his absence. A week passed, then another, with no word from the sheriff or his posse. Abigail maintained a stoic front, but Florence caught her scanning the horizon whenever a rider approached town, her expression momentarily hopeful before settling back into practiced indifference. Florence's own worry surprised her with its intensity. In just a few short weeks, Adams Turner had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The possibility that he might not return left her feeling adrift, as though something essential had been ripped away before she'd fully recognized its value. August brought suffocating heat and the increasing discomfort of Florence's advancing pregnancy. The baby would arrive in October, by her calculations. She worked steadily, saving every penny she could for the difficult months ahead. The townspeople had grown somewhat accustomed to her presence, though Victoria Blackwood's circle continued their cool disapproval whenever their paths crossed. It was during one of these encounters, as Florence was delivering packages to the hotel for Abigail, that disaster struck. Victoria and her friends were gathered on the hotel porch, ostensibly for afternoon tea but clearly enjoying the opportunity to observe and comment on passers-by. As Florence approached with her heavy basket, their conversation hushed, then resumed at a deliberately audible volume. "I heard the sheriff's posse returned to Las Vegas without success," one woman remarked. "Poor Sheriff Turner, such a dedicated lawman." "Too dedicated, perhaps," Victoria replied, "chasing outlaws across the territory while his own town's moral fabric frays." Florence kept her eyes forward, pretending not to hear as she climbed the porch steps. "Speaking of moral fraying," another woman murmured, "here comes the shopgirl with her package." Titters followed this poor attempt at wit. Florence felt her cheeks burning but maintained her dignity, nodding politely as she passed the group to enter the hotel. Inside, she delivered the supplies to the desk clerk and turned to leave, hoping to avoid another encounter with Victoria's group. But as she stepped back onto the porch, she found them arranged in a loose semicircle that effectively blocked her path. "Miss Harding," Victoria greeted her with false warmth. "We were just discussing the unfortunate situation with the sheriff's posse. Have you heard any news through Mrs. Miller?" "No, madam," Florence replied, trying to step around them. "If you'll excuse me, I need to get back to the store." "Of course, you're very busy," Victoria said, making no move to clear a path. "Though one wonders how you'll manage once your condition makes work impossible without family or husband to provide." "I'll manage, Mrs. Blackwood," Florence said firmly. "As women have always done when necessity demands it." Victoria's smile tightened. "Indeed, though usually those women have the support of their community, which requires a certain adherence to community standards." It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Florence met her gaze steadily. "I believe honest work and self-reliance are valued standards in any community worth belonging to." The older woman's eyes narrowed. "Pride comes before a fall, Miss Harding. Harold told me of his generous offer, which you refused. You may find that was unwise." "I don't consider it prideful to decline charity I haven't earned, Mrs. Blackwood," Florence replied, her patience wearing thin. "Now, please excuse me." She made to move past the women, but as she did, Victoria shifted subtly, her skirts brushing against Florence's legs. Off balance and encumbered by her pregnancy, Florence missed the step. She felt a moment of weightless terror as she pitched forward, her hands instinctively going to protect her belly rather than break her fall. The impact never came. Instead, strong arms caught her, steadying her against a broad chest as her basket clattered to the boardwalk, spilling its contents. "Are you all right?" a familiar voice asked, its usual calm edged with concern. Florence looked up into Adams Turner's face, lined with trail dust and what looked like several days' worth of beard but wonderfully, impossibly present. "You're back," she said foolishly, her heart racing from the near fall and his sudden appearance. Just rode in, he confirmed, his arms still supporting her. His eyes moved to the group of women watching with varying expressions of surprise and annoyance. Ladies, having a pleasant afternoon, Sheriff Turner, Victoria recovered first. We're so relieved to see you safely returned. Miss Harding had a moment of clumsiness, but fortunately, you arrived just in time. Adams's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Fortunate indeed, he said, his tone suggesting he hadn't missed the dynamics of the situation. He bent to retrieve Florence's scattered packages, placing them back in the basket before offering her his arm. May I escort you back to the store, Miss Harding? Abby will want to know I've returned. Florence took his arm gratefully, aware of the tableau they presented to Victoria and her friends, the pregnant, unmarried woman being publicly escorted by the town sheriff. It would fuel gossip for weeks, but in that moment, Florence found she didn't care. The famous Keller gang proved elusive, Adams remarked as they walked, his voice pitched for the benefit of any listening ears. But we did manage to recover most of the bank's money. Harold Blackwood will be pleased. Once they were out of earshot, his tone changed. Are you truly all right? That was no accident back there. Florence glanced up at him in surprise. I saw enough, he confirmed grimly. Victoria Blackwood is playing a dangerous game. She wants me gone from Cimarron, Florence said quietly. Adams's arm tightened beneath her hand. She wants what she can't have, he corrected, his voice rough with some emotion Florence couldn't identify. And she's willing to hurt you to get it. They walked in silence for a few steps, Florence acutely aware of his solid presence beside her, the strength of the arm supporting hers, the scent of dust and horses and something uniquely him. I missed you, she admitted suddenly, the words escaping before she could consider their wisdom. Adams stopped walking, turning to look at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Did you? Yes, she said simply, too tired for pretense. I was afraid you might not come back. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, then a warmth that made her heart race. I'll always come back, Florence, as long as there's something to come back to. The words hung between them, laden with meaning. Florence found herself unable to look away from his gaze, which held hers with an intensity that seemed to shut out the bustling street around them. Adams, she began, not sure what she meant to say, but feeling the need to say something. Sheriff Turner. The moment was broken by a shout from down the street. A young man was running toward them, waving urgently. Sheriff, there's trouble at the saloon. Keller's there. Adams's expression changed instantly, the lawman replacing the man who had looked at her with such tenderness a moment before. Get to the store, he told Florence, his voice leaving no room for argument. Stay with Abby, lock the doors. Adams, she protested, suddenly afraid. Go, he insisted, already moving away, his hand on his revolver. I'll come find you when it's over. Florence watched him stride away, the set of his shoulders resolute, and felt fear grip her heart. The Keller gang was dangerous. He'd spent weeks tracking them with no success, and now their leader was here in Cimarron, if anything happened to Adams. She couldn't bear to complete the thought. Instead, she hurried to the store where Abigail was waiting anxiously at the door. He's back, Florence said breathlessly, but Jack Keller is at the saloon. Adams went, of course he did, Abigail said, her face paling slightly despite her matter-of-fact tone. Come inside. He told you to stay here, I imagine. Florence nodded, allowing the older woman to usher her into the store, where they closed and locked the door as instructed. Through the window, they could see townspeople hurrying off the streets, doors closing up and down the main thoroughfare as word spread of trouble at the Red Dog Saloon. Will he be all right? Florence asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. Abigail's gaze was steady, though her hands betrayed her anxiety as they twisted in her apron. My brother is good at what he does, the best I've ever seen, but Jack Keller has killed 4 lawmen that we know of. The blunt assessment did nothing to calm Florence's fears. Why would Keller come here, knowing Adams was tracking him? Could be he didn't know, Abigail reasoned. Or could be he's here precisely because of Adams. Some men like Keller, they take it personally when a lawman gets too close. Florence felt cold despite the August heat. You mean he might have come to kill Adams specifically? Abigail didn't answer directly, her gaze fixed on the street outside. Adams can handle himself. He's faced worse than Jack Keller and come out standing. They fell silent, listening for the sound of gunfire, the minutes stretching unbearably. Florence found herself praying something she hadn't done since learning of Edward's betrayal, her hand unconsciously cradling her belly where the baby shifted restlessly, as though sensing her distress. When the shot finally came, it was a single report, sharp and definitive in the hushed afternoon. Florence flinched, her eyes meeting Abigail's across the room. One shot could mean many things: a warning, a misfire, a clean hit. They had no way of knowing who had fired or who, if anyone, had fallen. The waiting continued, more agonizing now. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, movement in the street caught their attention. 3 men emerged from the direction of the saloon, supporting a fourth between them. Florence pressed closer to the window, trying to make out their identities. "It's Adams," Abigail said, her voice tight. "He's wounded." Florence's heart seemed to stop. "How bad?" "Can't tell from here." Abigail was already moving to the door, unlocking it. "They're taking him to Doc Wilson's. I'm going there." "I'm coming with you," Florence insisted, following her outside despite Adams's instructions to stay in the store. They hurried down the street toward the doctor's small office, joining the growing crowd outside. Through snatches of conversation, Florence pieced together what had happened. Keller had been in the saloon, drinking heavily. Adams had entered alone, ordering everyone else out. Words were exchanged, then Keller drew. Adams was faster, but Keller had managed to get off a shot as he fell, striking the sheriff in the shoulder. "Let me through," Abigail commanded, her normally reserved manner giving way to fierce determination as she pushed through the onlookers. "He's my brother." Reluctantly, the crowd parted, allowing Abigail to enter the doctor's office. Florence hesitated, uncertain of her right to follow, but Abigail turned at the door, beckoning impatiently. "Come on," she said. "He'll want to see you're safe." Inside, the small waiting room was already crowded with the men who had helped bring Adams in. Through an open door, Florence could see him lying on a table, his shirt removed as Doc Wilson examined a bloody wound high on his left shoulder. "How is he?" Abigail demanded, moving immediately to her brother's side. "Lucky," the doctor replied tersely. "Bullet went clean through, missed anything vital. He'll have a sore arm for a while, but he'll heal fine if infection doesn't set in." Adams, pale but conscious, grimaced as the doctor probed the wound. "Told you it wasn't serious, Abby. No need to fuss." His gaze moved past his sister to where Florence stood in the doorway, and his expression changed subtly. "Florence, you were supposed to stay at the store." "You're lucky that's all she disobeyed," Abigail said tartly. "The way you went charging off alone to face Keller." "It's my job," he replied, his eyes still on Florence. "Are you all right?" After what happened at the hotel, Florence moved forward then, touched that even wounded, his concern was for her safety. "I'm fine. It's you who's been shot." "Keller's dead," one of the men who had brought Adams in reported from the doorway. "Clean shot through the heart. The rest of his gang was camped outside town. They've scattered now, but we should organize a patrol." Adams tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. You need to lie still and let me finish patching you up," Doc Wilson interrupted firmly. "Deputy Miller can handle the patrol." Florence glanced at Abigail in surprise. "Deputy?" "My nephew, James," Abigail explained. "Adams's official deputy. He's young but capable." The doctor continued working on Adams's shoulder, cleaning and bandaging the wound with practiced efficiency. "You'll need to rest that arm for at least a week," he instructed. "No riding, no lifting, no unnecessary movement." Adams looked as though he might argue but caught Florence's concerned gaze and subsided. "Fine, but I'll need to make a statement about Keller." "Tomorrow," Doc Wilson said firmly. "Right now you're going home to rest. Can you manage that, Abigail?" "I'll see to it," she promised, her relief evident now that it was clear Adams's injuries weren't life-threatening. The process of getting Adams home proved more complicated than anticipated. His house was on the outskirts of town, a small but well-built cabin that reflected its owner's practical nature. By the time they arrived, Adams was pale and sweating from the effort of walking, though he stubbornly refused to acknowledge his discomfort. Inside, the cabin was neat but Spartan, with few personal touches beyond a shelf of books and a framed photograph of a younger Abigail with a man Florence assumed was her late husband. Abigail directed Adams to his bed despite his protests, then turned to Florence. "I need to get back to the store and let James know what's happened," she said. "Would you mind staying with him? Make sure he actually rests instead of trying to write reports or clean his guns." Florence hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety of remaining alone with Adams in his home. As if reading her thoughts, Abigail added dryly, "No one will think anything of it, given your condition and his injury, and if they do, well, they're already talking anyway." Put that way, it seemed foolish to refuse. "Of course I'll stay," Florence agreed. "What should I do if his fever rises?" "There's willow bark tea in the cupboard," Abigail instructed, "and cool compresses if needed. I'll be back as soon as I can." After she left, Florence stood awkwardly in the doorway to Adams's bedroom, watching as he struggled to find a comfortable position, his face tight with pain he wouldn't admit to. "Can I get you anything?" she asked softly. "Water, something for the pain." Adams looked up, seeming almost surprised to find her still there. "Water would be good," he admitted, "and maybe help with this pillow. Can't seem to get it right with one arm." Florence moved to the bed, adjusting the pillow carefully to better support his injured shoulder. She was acutely aware of his proximity, the heat of his body, the scent of him beneath the medicinal smell of the doctor's antiseptic. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You don't have to stay, Florence. I know this isn't proper." "Propriety seems a small concern when you've been shot," she replied, going to fetch the water he'd requested. "Besides, I promised Abigail I'd make sure you rested." A ghost of a smile touched his lips as she returned with the water. "Abby worries too much. I've had worse than this." "That doesn't make it less serious now," Florence pointed out, helping him sit up slightly to drink. "And she cares about you, as do others in this town." Adams's gaze held hers over the rim of the cup. "Do you?" he asked quietly. "Care?" The directness of the question shouldn't have surprised her. It was characteristic of him. Still, Florence found herself momentarily at a loss for words. "Yes," she finally admitted, taking the empty cup from him. "I care." Adams closed his eyes briefly, an expression almost like relief crossing his face. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." Florence busied herself arranging things on his bedside table, uncomfortably aware of the intimacy of the situation her in his home, tending to him as a wife might. It stirred feelings she'd been trying to ignore since their conversation in the sheriff's office, feelings that had only intensified during his absence. "You should rest now," she said, stepping back from the bed. "Doctor's orders." "Stay," Adams said suddenly, his good hand catching hers. "Please. Just sit with me for a while." The request, so simple yet so revealing in its vulnerability, tugged at Florence's heart. She nodded, settling carefully into the chair beside his bed, her hand still held in his larger one. "Tell me something," he requested, his voice already showing signs of the exhaustion he'd been fighting. "Something about you, something I don't know yet," Florence considered, stroking her thumb absently across his knuckles. "I used to sing," she said finally. "At church, sometimes at social gatherings in Denver. My father said I had my mother's voice." Adams's eyes were heavy-lidded but intent on her face. "Will you sing for me sometime?" "Perhaps," she smiled. "When you're better." "I'd like that," he murmured, his eyes drifting closed. "I'd like to hear you sing." Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep, his hand relaxing around hers, though he didn't let go completely. Florence sat watching him, struck by how different he looked in repose. The stern lines of his face softened, the ever-present alertness temporarily set aside. It was in that quiet moment, with his hand warm in hers and her child moving beneath her heart, that Florence finally admitted to herself what she'd been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with Adams Turner. Not with the idea of rescue or security he represented, but with the man himself, his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, the gentleness that lay beneath his formidable exterior. The realization should have terrified her. After Edward's betrayal, she'd sworn never to trust a man again, to rely only on herself. Yet here she was, her heart opening despite all her best intentions. But Adams wasn't Edward. He'd never offered false promises or easy flattery. His actions spoke of respect, of genuine care. And there was that moment in the sheriff's office when he'd spoken of possibilities, of a child needing a father. Had he been offering what she thought he was? The baby kicked energetically, as if responding to her racing thoughts. Florence placed her free hand on her belly, wondering what future awaited this child. A future without a father's name, unless she pushed the thought away. It was too soon, too much to hope for. Adams was injured, vulnerable. Anything said or felt now might be the result of the day's drama, not lasting sentiment. Still, as she sat beside his bed, their hands linked in the quiet afternoon light, Florence allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to belong here with him. To be not a woman alone facing judgment and hardship, but part of something stronger, a family, a life built on mutual respect and growing affection. The thought brought both longing and fear. But for now, in the peaceful stillness of Adams's cabin, with the immediate danger past, Florence let herself simply be present in the moment, watching over the man who had come to mean so much to her in so short a time. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cimarron, a town that suddenly felt, despite everything, a little bit like home. Adams's recovery progressed steadily over the following days. Florence divided her time between the store and his cabin, helping Abigail manage both his care and the business. The townspeople's reactions to her presence in the sheriff's home were mixed, some openly disapproving, others surprisingly supportive, particularly after the story of Adams's confrontation with Keller spread through Cimarron. For his part, Adams proved to be a difficult patient, chafing at the restrictions on his movement and constantly attempting to return to his duties before Doc Wilson deemed it appropriate. It fell to Florence and Abigail to keep him in line, a task that often required firm words and occasional threats. "If you tear those stitches again, I'm leaving you to Abigail's tender mercies," Florence warned him a week after the shooting, having caught him attempting to saddle his horse one-handed. Adams had the grace to look sheepish, though there was a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Abby's bedside manner does leave something to be desired," he admitted. "Then listen to reason," Florence replied, taking the saddle from him and returning it to its rack in the small stable. "Another few days of rest, and Doc Wilson says you can return to light duties. Surely the town can survive that long without you." Adams sighed, running his good hand through his hair in a gesture she'd come to recognize as frustration. "It's not about the town, it's about feeling useless. I'm not good at sitting idle." Florence studied him, understanding better than he knew. "Neither am I, but sometimes waiting is the only path forward." His gaze sharpened at that, something in her tone catching his attention. "Is that what you've been doing? Waiting?" The question held layers of meaning that Florence wasn't sure she was ready to explore. "In a way," she answered carefully, "waiting for my child to be born, waiting to see what kind of life I can build for us here." Adams was silent for a moment, his eyes never leaving her face. "And have you decided," he finally asked, "is Cimarron where you want to build that life?" Florence thought of the small room behind Abigail's store, of the tentative friendships she'd begun to form with some of the townspeople, of the comfort she'd found in the routine of work and purpose. And she thought of the man before her who looked at her with such steady regard despite knowing all her secrets and vulnerabilities. "I'm beginning to think it might be," she admitted quietly. Something like hope flickered across Adams's face. He took a step toward her, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing wound. "Florence, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted whatever he'd been about to say. They both turned to see Deputy James Miller riding toward the cabin, his young face serious beneath the brim of his hat. "Uncle Adams," he called as he dismounted. "Got a telegram from Santa Fe, thought you'd want to see it right away." Adams's expression shifted back to that of the sheriff, personal matters set aside in the face of duty. "What is it?" James glanced at Florence, then back at his uncle. "It's about Edward Preston. He's been arrested for fraud and theft. They want to know if you have any additional charges to file on behalf of Miss Harding." Florence felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Edward arrested. After months of believing he'd escaped all consequences for his actions, to hear that he'd been caught, that there might be justice. "Florence." Adams's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right?" She nodded mechanically, unable to find words. Edward had taken everything from her: her father's savings, her reputation, her trust. He'd left her pregnant and alone, facing a future of hardship and judgment. And now he was in custody, finally facing consequences for at least some of his crimes. "What will happen to him?" she managed to ask. James shrugged. "Depends on how many charges stick. Fraud, theft, confidence schemes. He could be looking at years in territorial prison." "Good," Adams said flatly, his expression hard. "He deserves worse." Florence looked at him in surprise, struck by the vehemence in his tone. "You don't even know him." "I know what he did to you," Adams replied, his eyes meeting hers. "That's enough." There was such fierce protectiveness in his gaze that Florence felt something inside her shift, a final wall crumbling. Edward had hurt her deeply, but in doing so, he had inadvertently led her here to Cimarron, to Abigail's friendship, to Adams, Turner, and the possibility of a love more honest and enduring than anything Edward could have offered. "I need to think," she said, turning toward the cabin. "Excuse me." Inside, Florence sank onto the edge of Adams's bed, her thoughts in turmoil. Edward's arrest brought a complex mix of emotions: vindication, certainly, but also the realization that his punishment, however deserved, wouldn't undo the damage he'd caused. It wouldn't erase the whispers that followed her in town, wouldn't provide a father for her child, wouldn't restore what she'd lost. Yet even as these thoughts swirled, Florence found herself thinking not of Edward but of Adams, of the way he'd looked at her moments ago, of the question he'd been about to ask before James arrived. What had he wanted to say, and did she want to hear it? The door opened quietly and Adams entered alone, his expression concerned. "James has gone back to town," he said, crossing to sit beside her on the bed, close but not touching. "Do you want to talk about it?" Florence shook her head, then reconsidered. "I thought I'd feel differently if he was caught, relieved, perhaps, triumphant, but I just feel tired of carrying the weight of what he did." Adams was silent for a moment, his gaze steady on her face. "You don't have to carry it alone, Florence." The simple statement, offered without expectation or demand, broke something open inside her. "What were you going to ask me?" she said suddenly. Before James arrived, Adams looked momentarily surprised, then his expression softened into something more vulnerable than she'd ever seen from him. "I was going to ask if you'd consider staying, not just in Cimarron, but here with me." Florence's heart began to race. "As your housekeeper," the question was deliberately obtuse, an attempt to protect herself from hope. Adams saw through it immediately, a small smile touching his lips despite the seriousness of the moment. "No," he said quietly. "As my wife," though she'd half expected it, the words still stole her breath. "Adams, let me finish," he requested, his voice gentle but firm. "I know it's sudden. I know you've been hurt, that trusting doesn't come easy anymore, and I know your child is your priority, as it should be. I'm not asking out of pity or some misguided sense of chivalry." "Then why?" Florence whispered, needing to hear it. Adams reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "Because in the short time I've known you, Florence Harding, I've come to admire your courage, your intelligence, your determination to forge a path no matter the obstacles. Because when I'm with you, I feel something I haven't felt in years, the sense that I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm as he continued, "As for your child, that baby needs a father, not just any father, but one who will love it as his own, who will teach it honor and strength and kindness. I'd like to be that man if you'll let me." Florence felt tears gathering, blurring her vision of his earnest face. "You barely know me," she protested weakly. "I know enough," Adams replied, echoing what he'd said to her that first night in Cimarron. The rest we can discover together. His honesty, his lack of flowery promises or grand declarations, touched Florence deeply. This was no smooth-talking confidence man offering the moon. This was a good, steady man offering what he could himself, his name, his protection, and the possibility of a shared future built day by day. "I can't promise that what I feel now will be enough for you," she said honestly. "After Edward, I'm still learning to trust again, but I care for you, Adams, more than I thought possible." His expression was patient, understanding. That's a starting place, a good one. Many marriages begin with less. Florence considered his words, her hand still held in his. She thought of the life that awaited her child if she refused the whispers, the closed doors, the struggle of a single mother in a world that had little mercy for women without men's protection. And she thought of what Adams offered, not just security, but respect, kindness, the chance to build something honest and enduring. "Yes," she said finally, the word both terrifying and liberating. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that transformed Adams's face made her heart skip a beat. It was boyish, almost shy, revealing a side of him few in Cimarron ever saw. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'll do right by you, Florence," he promised, his blue eyes serious despite his smile. "By you and your child, that I swear." "Our child," she corrected softly, the words strange but right on her tongue. "If you're to be its father in truth." Something fierce and protective flashed in Adams's gaze. "Our child," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "From this day forward." He leaned toward her slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Florence didn't move, her heart thundering in her chest as his lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle yet firm, a promise sealed without words. His good arm came around her, drawing her closer, and Florence allowed herself to lean into his strength, to accept what he offered so freely. When they parted, both a little breathless, Adams rested his forehead against hers. "I should speak to Reverend Thomason, unless you want to wait." "No," Florence said, surprising herself with her certainty. "I don't want to wait, not when we've already lost so much time." Adams nodded, understanding without need for explanation. In a town like Cimarron, marriages often happened quickly when circumstances demanded it. There would be talk, of course speculation about the timing, about the baby's parentage, but being Adams Turner's wife would shield Florence from the worst of it. 2 weeks, he decided. Time enough for my shoulder to heal properly and for you to be sure this is what you want. "And if I change my mind?" Florence asked, not because she thought she would, but because she needed to know she could. "Then you change your mind," Adams said simply. "I won't hold you to anything you don't freely choose, Florence, not ever." The assurance meant more than he could know. Edward had manipulated, cajoled, pressured. Adams offered choice, respect for her agency, even if her decision might hurt him. It was perhaps the clearest indication yet of the difference between the men and of why she could trust this one where the other had betrayed her so completely. "I won't change my mind," she told him, believing it as she spoke. "But thank you for giving me the freedom to do so if I needed it." Adams smiled, pressing another brief kiss to her lips before standing. "I should go tell Abby. She'll be insufferable, of course. She's been pushing me toward marriage for years." Florence laughed, the sound surprising her after the emotional intensity of their conversation. "She all but told me you were interested weeks ago. I thought she was imagining things." "Abby sees more than most give her credit for," Adams admitted, offering his hand to help Florence up. "She saw what you were bringing into my life before I fully understood it myself." As they walked hand in hand toward the door, Florence felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be adjustments, challenges, the complex reality of building a marriage while preparing for a child conceived with another man. But for the first time since learning of her pregnancy, Florence felt hope instead of dread when she thought of the future. Adams Turner might not have been the man she'd expected, but he was the man she needed, steady, honorable, strong enough to stand beside her rather than above her. And perhaps, in time, the care she already felt for him would deepen into something as enduring as the mountains that watched over Cimarron. For now, It was enough to know that she and her child would not face the future alone. That this man, this town, this unexpected turn in her journey had given her something Edward Preston had never truly offered: a place to belong, a chance to begin again, and the promise of love built on truth rather than lies. The wedding took place on a clear September morning, with the aspen trees just beginning to turn gold against the deep blue of the New Mexico sky. Florence wore a simple dress of ivory muslin that Abigail had helped her alter to accommodate her growing belly. Adams, still moving carefully because of his healing shoulder but resplendent in a new black suit, waited for her at the small church with an expression that made her heart flutter despite her nervousness. The ceremony was brief and straightforward, Reverend Thomason keeping his remarks mercifully free of references to Florence's condition or the unusual circumstances of their courtship. When Adams slid a simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's, Abigail had told her with unexpected sentimentality and promised to cherish and protect her all the days of his life, Florence found herself blinking back tears. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared, and just like that, Florence Harding became Florence Turner, a transformation that felt both momentous and strangely natural, as though she had been moving toward this moment since stepping off the stagecoach in Cimarron. The small reception that followed at Abigail's store was a surprisingly joyful affair. Most of the town turned out, curiosity perhaps as much a motivator as genuine goodwill, but Florence was touched by the number of sincere well-wishes she received. Even Victoria Blackwood made a brief appearance, her congratulations stiff but formally correct, her husband notably absent. "Don't mind Victoria," Abigail murmured as they watched the banker's wife depart. "She'll come around eventually." Harold's been keeping a low profile since Adams filed those accessory charges against Edward Preston on your behalf. "Seems your former beau implicated Blackwood in some of his schemes." Florence stared at her new sister-in-law in shock. Harold Blackwood was working with Edward. Abigail nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. "Nothing that will stick in court, probably, but enough to tarnish that moral superiority he and Victoria are so fond of displaying. They'll be less eager to cast stones at your glass house now that theirs has a few cracks showing." Before Florence could process this revelation, Adams appeared at her side, his hand coming to rest protectively at the small of her back. "Everything all right?" he asked, noting her expression. "Just fine," Abigail assured him. "I was telling Florence about Harold's connection to Preston. Thought she should know why the Blackwoods have been unusually subdued lately." Adams's jaw tightened slightly. "I was going to tell her once things settled down, didn't want to add to her worries before the wedding." "It's all right," Florence assured him, placing her hand on his arm. "I'm glad to know. It explains why they were so eager to send me to Santa Fe. They must have been afraid I knew something that could implicate Harold." "Which you didn't," Adams confirmed, "but they couldn't be certain. Your father's business records might have contained evidence." Florence shook her head, marveling at the interconnectedness of events that had seemed random at the time. "And to think I almost accepted his offer if you hadn't come into the store that day." "But I did," Adams said simply, covering her hand with his, "and here we are." The quiet certainty in his voice steadied Florence, as it had so many times over the past weeks. Whatever complications lay behind them or ahead of them, this man beside her was her anchor now, his strength and integrity a foundation she could build upon. The celebration continued into the afternoon, but as the day wore on, Florence found herself growing tired, the excitement and emotion of the day taking their toll. Adams noticed immediately, making their excuses to the remaining guests and escorting her back to their cabin on the edge of town. Inside, the familiar space had been transformed in subtle ways. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, a new quilt brightened the bed, and a small cradle stood in the corner of the bedroom, Abigail's wedding gift, crafted by a local carpenter who had owed her a favor. "Do you like it?" Adams asked, watching her take in the changes. "Abby helped with some of it while we were at the church this morning." "It's perfect," Florence said sincerely, touched by the thoughtfulness behind the preparations. This wasn't just Adams accepting her into his space. This was him making room for her, for their shared life, for the child that would join them soon. An awkward silence fell between them, both acutely aware of the transition they now faced from courting to marriage, from separate lives to a shared one. Florence felt suddenly shy, uncertain of what Adams expected or what she was ready to give. As if sensing her discomfort, Adams moved to the stove instead of toward her. "You should rest," he said, his tone matter of fact. "I'll make some coffee or tea if you prefer." The normalcy of the offer, the absence of pressure or expectation, eased some of Florence's tension. "Tea would be lovely," she said, sinking gratefully into a chair at the small table. They settled into a domestic routine that felt both new and somehow familiar. Adams moving about the kitchen with the same quiet competence he brought to his work as sheriff. Florence watched him, still marveling that this man was now her husband, that she was now Florence Turner, that the child within her would bear his name. "What are you thinking?" Adams asked, bringing her a cup of fragrant tea and sitting across from her. Florence considered the question, then decided on honesty. "I'm thinking that I never expected to be here, that when Edward left me I thought my life was over in many ways, and now, Adams prompted gently when she fell silent. "And now I'm beginning to believe it was just beginning," she finished, meeting his gaze across the table. "That perhaps losing everything I thought I wanted made room for what I truly needed." Something warm and tender flickered in Adams's eyes. "And what is it you truly need, Florence Turner?" The use of her new name sent a small thrill through her. "Honesty," she answered after a moment's thought. "Respect, purpose." She paused, then added softly, "And someone who sees me clearly and values what they see." Adams reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I do see you, Florence. Your strength, your intelligence, your capacity for caring despite being hurt, and I value all of you." The simple declaration, delivered without artifice or exaggeration, touched Florence deeply. Edward had offered grand compliments and sweeping declarations. Adams offered plain truth and steady regard. The difference between them had never been clearer. "I want to be a good wife to you," she said, surprising herself with the admission, "but I'm not sure I know how. My mother died when I was young, and my father, he loved me, but he didn't prepare me for marriage." Adams's thumb traced gentle patterns on her palm, a gesture that was becoming comfortingly familiar. "I'm not looking for some idea of a good wife from a ladies' magazine," he said. "I'm looking for you, Florence, for your companionship, your thoughts, your help in building a life together. The rest we'll figure out as we go." The reassurance eased something tight in Florence's chest. "And the baby. Are you truly prepared for what it will mean to raise another man's child as your own?" Adams was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than troubled. "When I was 12, he finally said, my father died in a mining accident. My mother remarried a year later a man named Joseph Turner. He gave us his name, his protection, worked hard to provide for us. Never once did he treat me or Abby as anything less than his own." Florence listened, understanding beginning to dawn. "He adopted you," Adams nodded. "In every way that mattered. He wasn't perfect, had a temper, drank too much sometimes, but he loved us. Taught me what it means to be a man, to take responsibility for those who depend on you. When I think about your child, Florence, I don't see another man's baby. I see our child who will need love and guidance just like I did." Tears filled Florence's eyes at the simple, profound statement. "Your stepfather would be proud of the man you've become," she said softly. "I hope so," Adams replied, a hint of vulnerability in his voice that he rarely showed. "I've tried to live up to what he taught me." Florence squeezed his hand, feeling a new depth of connection forming between them. This shared understanding of family bonds that went beyond blood, of chosen responsibilities and love freely given, felt like a foundation they could build upon. The moment was interrupted by a particularly energetic movement from the baby, visible even through Florence's dress. She laughed, placing her free hand on her belly. "Someone else wants to join the conversation, it seems." Adams's eyes widened slightly, his gaze drawn to the movement. "May I?" He asked hesitantly, Gesturing toward her stomach, Florence nodded, guiding his large hand to the spot where the baby was most active. For a moment, nothing happened, then there was a decided kick against his palm. Adams's expression of wonder was something Florence knew she would remember all her days. "Strong," he said softly, his hand gentle on her rounded belly. Like its mother, the simple praise warmed Florence from within. "I hope so," she replied. "The world isn't always kind to those who are different." Adams's expression sobered. "No, it isn't, but this child will have two people standing between it and that unkindness. That's more than many can claim." As the evening deepened into night, they continued talking, sharing stories and hopes, learning each other in this new context of marriage. When Florence finally admitted to exhaustion, Adams showed her where he'd made space for her things, helped her prepare for bed with a consideration that spoke of respect rather than disinterest, then surprised her by taking a blanket to the small settee in the main room. "You don't have to sleep there," Florence said, embarrassed by his gallantry yet secretly relieved. She wasn't ready for the physical aspects of marriage, not yet, and had been afraid to broach the subject. "I want you to be comfortable," Adams replied simply. "There's no rush, Florence. We have time to let things develop naturally between us." The understanding in his eyes, free from resentment or impatience, confirmed what Florence was beginning to believe. That in Adams Turner she had found not just security or protection, but a partner in the truest sense, someone who saw her needs clearly and respected them, who offered what she could accept and didn't demand what she couldn't yet give. "Thank you," she said softly, knowing the words were inadequate but unable to find better ones. Adams smiled, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Sleep well, Mrs. Turner. Tomorrow's the first day of our life together." As Florence lay in what was now her bed, listening to the quiet sounds of Adams settling on the settee in the next room, she felt a peace she hadn't known in months. The future still held uncertainties: the baby's birth, the adjustment to motherhood, the gradual building of a marriage that had begun with practical considerations rather than passionate love, but for the first time, those uncertainties didn't frighten her. Whatever came, she would face it with Adams beside her. And that, she was beginning to believe, would make all the difference. The weeks following the wedding settled into a rhythm that was both new and comfortably familiar. Florence continued working at the store, though Abigail insisted she take more frequent breaks as her pregnancy advanced. Adams returned to his full duties as sheriff, but made a point of checking in with Florence throughout the day, bringing her lunch or simply stopping by to ensure she was feeling well. The town's reaction to their marriage was largely positive, with even the most skeptical observers grudgingly acknowledging that Sheriff Turner seemed genuinely content with his new wife. Victoria Blackwood maintained a cool distance, but without her husband's influence behind her herald, having departed hastily for business in Denver after Adams's investigation into his connection with Edward Preston. Her circle of influence had diminished considerably. At home, Florence and Adams developed a partnership based on mutual respect and growing affection. They shared meals and conversation, gradually learning each other's habits and preferences. Adams proved to be unexpectedly domestic, cooking surprisingly well and maintaining his small home with the same orderliness he brought to his work. Florence contributed her own skills, particularly in organization and planning, helping Adams with the administrative aspects of his position that he openly admitted to disliking. Their sleeping arrangements remained separate, with Adams continuing to use the settee despite Florence's increasing guilt about taking his bed. "When you're ready, and after the baby comes, we'll revisit this," he told her when she broached the subject. "Until then, I'm perfectly comfortable where I am." His patience, his willingness to let their physical relationship develop at her pace, deepened Florence's respect for him. There were moments when his hand lingered on hers, or when their eyes met across the table at dinner, when she felt a stirring of something more than friendship or gratitude. But Adams never pressed, never made her feel that she was failing as a wife by not sharing his bed in the fullest sense. October arrived with cooler temperatures, and the knowledge that the baby would come soon. Florence's preparations took on a greater urgency, finalizing the small space they'd set aside for a nursery, washing and arranging the baby clothes that had been gifts from Abigail, and, surprisingly, several other women in town who had gradually warmed to the sheriff's new wife. "Have you thought about names?" Adams asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Florence sewing a tiny gown while he cleaned his revolver, a ritual she'd come to find oddly comforting in its familiarity. Florence looked up, realizing she hadn't considered this important detail. "I haven't," she admitted. "It seemed, I don't know, tempting fate, perhaps." Adams set aside his work, his expression gentle but serious. "The baby will be here soon. It should have a name waiting for it." "You're right, of course," Florence agreed, setting down her sewing. "Do you have any preferences? Family names, perhaps?" The question seemed to surprise him. "You'd consider naming the child after my family." Florence studied his face, understanding his uncertainty. "Adams, we've agreed that you'll be this child's father in every way that matters." "Why wouldn't I consider your family names?" Something warm and grateful flickered in his eyes. "My father, my birth father, was named William, and Joseph, of course, was the man who raised me. For a girl, my mother's name was Eleanor." "William Joseph for a boy," Florence said thoughtfully. "Eleanor for a girl, both are lovely names." "What about your family?" Adams asked. "Your father's name?" "Henry," Florence replied, a pang of grief still accompanying thoughts of her father. "And my mother was Grace." Adams nodded, considering. "William Henry, Eleanor Grace." Names with history on both sides. The thought of their child carrying both lineages, honored equally despite the circumstances of its conception, touched Florence deeply. "Yes," she agreed softly. "That's perfect." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Adams rose immediately, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster before he caught himself. Even in his own home, the sheriff was always alert to potential danger. He opened the door to reveal Deputy James, looking apologetic but determined. "Sorry to disturb you, Uncle Adams, but there's trouble at the saloon. Tom Reed's threatening to shoot Manuel Sanchez over a card game, says Sanchez cheated him." Adams sighed, glancing back at Florence. "I need to handle this." "Of course," she nodded, hiding her disappointment at the interrupted evening. This was part of being married to the sheriff, these moments when duty called him away, often at inconvenient times. "I won't be long," he promised, strapping on his gun belt and reaching for his hat. "Don't wait up if you're tired." Florence watched him go, struck by how naturally they'd fallen into the rhythms of married life, despite the unusual circumstances of their union. When Adams returned hours later, finding her still awake and reading by the fire, his smile of pleased surprise warmed her in ways she hadn't expected. "You didn't have to wait," he said, hanging his hat and gun belt on the peg by the door. "I wanted to," Florence replied simply. "Is everything all right at the saloon?" Adams nodded, sinking wearily into the chair opposite hers. "Reed was drunk, Sanchez wasn't cheating, got them both cooled off and headed home." Florence set aside her book. "You look tired. Would you like some tea or something stronger?" "Just your company," Adams said, the honesty that was so characteristic of him showing in his direct gaze. "It's nice to come home to someone who asks about my day." The simple admission touched Florence deeply. For all his strength and self-sufficiency, Adams had been alone for a long time. Perhaps he needed her as much as she needed him, not for protection or security, but for companionship, for the comfort of shared moments at the end of a long day. They talked quietly for a while, the fire burning low, until Florence felt the first twinge a tightening across her abdomen that was different from the practice contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. She paused mid-sentence, her hand going to her belly. "Florence." Adams was instantly alert, noticing her expression. "What is it?" "I'm not sure," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Probably nothing, just a stronger pain than usual." Adams watched her carefully, concern evident in his face. "Should I get the doctor?" Florence shook her head. "It's too early to disturb him. First babies often take their time coming, or so Abigail tells me." She attempted a reassuring smile. "It could be hours yet before anything significant happens, if this is even the beginning." Adams didn't look convinced, but he nodded, respecting her judgment. "Tell me if it happens again, or if anything changes." Within an hour, it became clear that this was indeed the beginning of labor. The contractions were still far apart but growing in intensity, each one requiring Florence's full concentration to breathe through. Adams watched with increasing concern, finally insisting on fetching Doc Wilson despite the late hour. "Better to have him here too early than too late," he said firmly, and Florence, in the grip of another contraction, could only nod her agreement. The doctor arrived promptly, his experienced eye taking in the situation at a glance. "First baby," he said, patting Florence's hand. "Likely to be a while yet, but you were right to call me Sheriff." The hours that followed tested Florence's endurance in ways she hadn't imagined possible. The pain built steadily, washing over her in waves that left her gasping. Through it all, Adams remained by her side, offering his hand to squeeze, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring encouragement that she clung to as the night deepened toward dawn. "You're doing wonderfully," Doc Wilson assured her as he checked her progress. "Everything's proceeding normally, not much longer now." Florence, exhausted and in pain, found it hard to believe that this ordeal could ever end. "I can't," she whispered after a particularly brutal contraction. "Adams, I can't do this." "You can," he replied, his voice steady and certain. "You're the strongest woman I know, Florence Turner, and our child is counting on that strength right now, our child." The simple phrase gave Florence a renewed sense of purpose. This baby, conceived in a moment of misplaced trust with one man, would be born into the care of another who had already claimed it as his own. The thought gave her courage to face the increasing intensity of the labor. Just as the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Doc Wilson announced that it was time to push. Adams moved behind Florence, supporting her as she bore down with each contraction, his strength lending itself to hers in the most fundamental way. "I can see the head," the doctor reported after several exhausting pushes. "One more good effort, Mrs. Turner." Florence gathered her remaining strength, bearing down with a determination born of months of facing challenges she'd never anticipated. With a final, tremendous effort, she felt the baby slip from her body, followed by an instant of shocking silence. Then came the cry, strong, indignant, alive, the most beautiful sound Florence had ever heard. "A girl," Doc Wilson announced, his professional demeanor briefly giving way to a smile as he placed the squirming, red-faced infant on Florence's chest. "A perfect little girl." Florence stared down at her daughter, overwhelmed by a love so fierce and immediate that it took her breath away. Tiny hands waved in protest at this cold, bright world, a cap of dark hair plastered to a perfectly formed head, eyes screwed shut against the morning light. "Eleanor," she whispered, glancing up at Adams, who was staring at the baby with an expression of wonder. "Eleanor Grace Turner." Adams nodded, seemingly unable to speak. He reached out hesitantly, his large hand gentle as he touched the baby's tiny fist. To Florence's amazement, Eleanor's fingers uncurled and then closed around Adams's index finger, holding on with surprising strength. "She knows her father," Doc Wilson remarked casually as he continued his work. The simple statement, offered without qualification or hesitation, brought tears to Florence's eyes. She looked up at Adams, expecting to see the same emotion reflected in his face, but found him still staring at the baby, his expression one of pure awe. "She's perfect," he finally said, his voice rough with feeling. "Absolutely perfect." In that moment, as the three of them formed a tableau of family mother, father, newborn child, Florence felt something settle within her, a certainty that had been building since the day she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Cimarron. This was where she belonged. This man, this child, this life they would build together. This was home. The next few hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and joy. Doc Wilson efficiently handled the aftermath of the birth, pronounced both mother and child healthy, and promised to return later in the day to check on them. Abigail arrived shortly after receiving Adams's message, her usual brisk manner softening at the sight of her new niece. "She has your eyes," she told her brother, who was holding Eleanor with careful reverence. Same shape, at least, though the color will probably change. Adams looked up from the baby's face with an expression that combined pride and something like bewilderment. She's so small, he marveled. How can something so small be so perfect? Abigail glanced at Florence, a knowing look passing between the women. That's how they get you, she said dryly. You look at them and think they can't possibly be real, and the next thing you know, they own your heart entirely. It was the closest Abigail had come to acknowledging her own loss, the child who had drawn just one breath before departing. Florence reached out, squeezing the older woman's hand in silent understanding. I'll handle things at the store, Abigail said briskly, reclaiming her usual practical demeanor. And I've told James to manage any sheriff business that can't wait. You two need time with that little one. After she left, Adams carefully returned Alina to Florence's arms, watching as the baby rooted instinctively, seeking nourishment. Do you need privacy? He asked uncertainly as Florence prepared to nurse. Florence considered, then shook her head. No, she's your daughter too. There shouldn't be secrets between us about her care. Adams sat beside them on the bed, his expression a mixture of tenderness and something deeper as he watched Florence guide Alina to her breast. The baby latched on with surprising determination, her tiny hands flexing against Florence's skin. I never thought I'd have this, Adams said quietly after a few moments of watching them. A family of my own, after Abby lost her baby and Samuel after seeing what that did to her. I thought perhaps it wasn't meant for me. Florence looked up, struck by the vulnerability in his admission. And now I understand what my stepfather must have felt, he replied, his gaze moving between Florence and the nursing infant. This sense that nothing in the world matters more than protecting what's right here in this room. The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet certainty, filled Florence with a warmth that had nothing to do with the physical aftermath of birth. This was what she'd hoped for but hadn't dared expect when she'd agreed to marry Adams, not just security or respectability, but a genuine partnership, a shared love for the child they would raise together. I'm glad it's you, she said softly. That Alina will have you as her father. That I have you as my husband. Adams's eyes met hers, something flickering in their blue depths that made her heart skip a beat. Florence, he began, his voice rough with emotion, I know our marriage began with practicality, with me offering what you needed. But these past weeks, watching you make a place in my home, in my life, my feelings have changed. Deepened. Florence felt her breath catch, the baby still nursing contentedly at her breast as this moment unfolded between them. Mine too, she admitted, the words both frightening and liberating to speak aloud. I didn't expect it. After Edward, I thought I'd never trust again, never feel what? Adams prompted gently when she faltered. Florence gathered her courage, knowing that honesty between them had always been the foundation of their relationship. Never feel love again, she finished quietly. But I was wrong. What I feel for you isn't gratitude or convenience, it's more, much more. The smile that transformed Adams's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then suddenly brilliant. He leaned forward, careful of the baby between them, and kissed Florence with a tenderness that spoke more eloquently than words of his own feelings. When they parted, both a little breathless, Alina had fallen asleep at Florence's breast, milk-drunk and content in the circle of her mother's arms. Adams gently took her, his large hands impossibly careful as he settled her in the cradle beside the bed. You should rest, he told Florence, smoothing back her sweat-dampened hair with a gentle touch. I'll watch over both of you. Florence nodded, exhaustion finally claiming her now that the intensity of birth and the emotional revelations that followed had passed. As she drifted toward sleep, she felt Adams settle beside her on the bed, not to sleep but simply to be close, his hand finding hers in a connection that seemed as essential as breathing. In that moment of floating between wakefulness and dreams, Florence found herself thinking of the long journey that had brought her here from Denver to Cimarron, from betrayal to trust, from solitary fear to shared joy. Edward Preston had left her nothing, or so she'd thought. But in driving her from her home, in forcing her to forge a new path, He had inadvertently led her to something far more precious than anything he could have offered. The last thought that crossed her mind before sleep claimed her was a silent gratitude not for Edward, who deserved none, but for the mysterious workings of fate that had placed her in the path of a man who could look at another man's child and see only his daughter, who could take a woman wounded by betrayal and offer her not pity but partnership, not mere security but love. In the weeks and months that followed, as Alina grew from newborn to infant to toddling 1 year old, that partnership deepened into something neither Florence nor Adams could have anticipated when they'd exchanged their practical vows. The respect and care that had marked their early relationship blossomed into a love that was all the stronger for having grown gradually, rooted in shared experiences and mutual understanding rather than passion alone. Adams proved to be a devoted father, finding in Alina a source of joy and tenderness that balanced the often harsh realities of his work as sheriff. He would spend hours with her, his large hands gentle as he built block towers for her to knock down, his voice soft as he read to her from the books he collected on his infrequent trips to Santa Fe. Florence continued helping at the store part-time, bringing Alina with her, much to the delight of customers who had long since accepted the sheriff's wife and daughter as valued members of the community. Even Victoria Blackwood, returning from an extended stay in Denver after her husband's disgrace, eventually thought enough to comment on Alina's prettiness and Adams's evident pride in his family. Edward Preston remained in territorial prison, his schemes having caught up with him at last. Florence occasionally thought of him, not with anger or regret, but with a distant sort of pity. He had sought wealth and status through deception, while she had found something far more valuable through honesty and perseverance. On the evening of Alina's first birthday, as they sat on the porch of what was now a slightly expanded cabin, Adams, having added a proper bedroom for Alina, and made other improvements to accommodate their growing family, Florence found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past 2 years. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Adams asked, his arm around her shoulders as they watched Alina playing with a wooden horse he'd carved for her birthday. Florence smiled, leaning into his embrace. "About how differently things turned out than I expected when I first arrived in Cimarron." Adams chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. "I imagine you didn't plan on marrying the local sheriff and setting up house on the edge of town." "No," Florence agreed, her hand finding his where it rested on her shoulder. "But I'm very glad that's what happened." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Alina, tiring of her game, toddled over to them, demanding to be lifted onto her father's lap. Adams obliged, settling the little girl against his chest with the practiced ease of a man who had embraced fatherhood wholly and without reservation. Alina's dark hair, so like her mother's, curled around her face, framing eyes that had indeed stayed blue, like the man she called Papa with such joyful certainty. "I have something to tell you," Florence said, turning slightly to face her husband. "Something I've been waiting to be sure about before mentioning." Adams raised an eyebrow, his expression curious but patient. "Is everything all right?" Florence nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "More than all right. I believe Alina will have a brother or sister by next spring." The news took a moment to register, then Adams's face lit with a joy that never failed to touch Florence's heart. "You're certain?" he asked, his free hand instinctively moving toward her still flat stomach. "As certain as one can be at this stage," she confirmed, covering his hand with her own. "Doc Wilson confirmed it yesterday." Adams looked down at Alina, who was playing contentedly with the buttons on his shirt, then back at Florence, his eyes bright with emotion. "A family of 4, he said wonderfully. "Did you ever imagine—" "No," Florence admitted, leaning in to kiss him softly. "But then, the best parts of my life have been the ones I never imagined." As the evening deepened into twilight, with Alina falling asleep against Adams's chest and the promise of new life growing within her, Florence felt a contentment that went beyond happiness into something deeper and more enduring. The path that had brought her here had not been easy or direct, but it had led to precisely where she was meant to be in the end. Edward Preston had left her nothing but heartache and uncertainty. But from that emptiness, she had built something precious and real a life with a man who had looked at her in her darkest moment and seen not a burden but a possibility, who had said simply, "That baby needs a father," and then become one in every way that mattered. And that, Florence reflected as she leaned against her husband's shoulder in the gathering dusk, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them and their second child just beginning its journey, was a love story worth all the hardship it had taken to find it.